All right. Good morning. This is final week of a series of lessons about the character of Jesus. And Larry and I will take turns 1 to 3 weeks at a time this summer teaching. Larry will start next week in the adult class, so this is our final lesson of this series. And we've looked at all the things about Jesus that make him one of a kind, and we've reflected on the fact that you can't make up a character like that. He must be a genuine revelation from God. One of the things at the end of the book that the author reflected on was not only why did he not really realize all this earlier in life, but why is it kind of easy for us to have taken Jesus for granted, so to speak, to have not noticed some of these things. So I want to reflect upon what are the things that make Jesus be taken for granted a little bit by some of us, by all of us, really. And first of all, at the time of Jesus, he was a revolutionary figure. But the success of Christianity in the Western world for many, many centuries, especially in America, made it kind of easy for people to identify themselves as Christians and say, yeah, I'm a member of this church and so on. And it was kind of the safe, respectable thing to be. And you didn't really have to dive deeply into the character of Jesus. You could have a somewhat superficial faith in a way. You know, it was possible for large numbers of people to go to church and to say, yeah, I'm a Christian, but not really to be deeply into Jesus and studying his every word and reflecting on it and so on. And those of us who grew up in a church, which I sort of did and sort of didn't, actually, but I think particularly of my own sons, when you grow up in a church and you're taken to a church from the time you're little, sometimes you start thinking, I know this stuff. I've heard all these stories. I've read these Bible stories. You know, I recall my two boys when they were at Covenant School in high school, and they'd get their interim grade report, and it'd be, you know, A minus in Bible. And I would say, out of all the courses, you know, and when I talked to them, I'd figure out that they didn't work as hard at the beginning of the year in Bible because their attitude was, whether they realized it or not, was, I know that stuff. You know, I've had the Bible taught to me since I was little. I know this stuff. Well, but they had teachers who were teaching things in a new and deeper way or challenging them, and they needed to rise to the challenge, but they kind of had that attitude of, look, I've been going to church my whole life, you know, so Bible class, that's easy. I don't really need to worry about Bible class. Well, actually they did, and they had to catch up, you know. I recall quite a long time ago, those of you who remember the Newtons, Mike Newton and family, you remember their daughter Ashley Newton, when she was about 6th grade, so that puts this quite a few years ago. But I was asked to substitute teach for the 6th grade class, 6th and 7th grade class, just 1 week. And I thought, well, what do you teach if you just have 1 week with a group of kids? All you can really do is give them something. If they could remember one important thing, you've succeeded in the class. If they walk out of there and remember one thing for life, then that was a successful class. Because, you know, most of the time, I recall when one of my old preachers from Dallas passed through Charlottesville and visited, and I came up here to him and after service, and I was talking to him, and I said, you know, I remember a few years ago, you gave a sermon, it was around Christmas time, and he said, wait, stop. He said, let me just bask in this for a minute. We preachers wonder if anybody on Monday can remember anything that we said. And you're telling me a few years ago that I said something. Okay, go ahead, he said. But that's true. You need to figure out how to say something that might stick with somebody and be memorable. And it's a lot easier to preach once a year than every week, I can assure you. And it's easier to be a substitute teacher, I guess, for 1 week than to come up with a quarter's worth of things to teach teens. And as a result, I thought, and I said, well, if I want these young people to remember one thing, I'm going to teach about this. I told them, by your age, you've probably already heard some of the Bible stories multiple times in your life. And you might be tempted to think, I at the beginning of a story, I've heard this story before. But I just want to give you a personal testimony that I've heard these stories and studied these books of the Bible many, many times. And I'm still learning. I go to a class and the teacher teaches something and I get new insight even though I have been through that story multiple times. And I wanted to leave them with the idea, for the rest of your life in church, you're going to experience some of the same things being taught, but in different ways. And you're going to learn things from portions of the Bible that you've read multiple times. And it will stick with you. It'll make an impression on you. Now that still happens to me today at my advanced age. On Wednesday night, we're studying from the period of the kings and prophets. Tim is teaching from the Saul to the divided kingdom. We just covered Elijah and the prophets of Baal. Now, I've read all that many times in my life. And actually, we had an extensive series that Isaac taught on Wednesday night 10 years ago or less, where we went through all those. And there's been other people who've taught over the years on that, going back to my childhood and so on. And yet on Wednesday nights, I keep hearing things and thinking about things and realizing I never thought about exactly this thing before. You know, and so we're tempted. Are you ever tempted if a teacher gets up to begin a new quarter and says, okay, this quarter we're going to study the book of whatever, James or whatever. Are you ever tempted to think, we just studied the book of James a couple of years ago and I've read it, how many times? Are you ever skeptical that you're going to learn something? Maybe. But actually, we should recognize that God's Word interacts with us, and you're in a new state of mind compared to a few years ago. And the Word interacts with you also, and it's always new. If you're always growing, there's always some new perspective you have because you're going through new things in your life. And a new teacher says something a little different from a previous teacher, and suddenly you think about something for the first time. And we need to be that way with Jesus. We need to realize that Jesus is someone that we can respond to infinitely, and that we can always have a new insight and a new appreciation for him. But there's various threads that go through our civilization that lead people to not think so much about Jesus and not get what we should out of Jesus. And the author talks about a few of them. The Enlightenment and the accompanying scientific revolution that we've experienced for several centuries now Not only did that bring a lot of advancements in science and technology, but recently it caused a lot of people to set up a false opposition of faith versus science. And it tarnished, diminished Christianity in the eyes of a lot of people. Actually, Christians were in the forefront of the scientific revolution. Copernicus, Bray, Galileo, Kepler, the most famous names in producing revolutionary understandings of astronomy, were all Christians. Boyle, Lavoisier, pioneers in chemistry. Faraday, Maxwell, pioneers in physics. These were all Christians, and there's many others that we could list. Christians established the first universities in the world. Christians were actually at the forefront of a little scientific revolution that was 2 or 3 centuries before what we think of as the Enlightenment. In the so-called Middle Ages, at the early universities and some of the main cathedrals, they actually became centers of learning that started to produce a scientific revolution. But modern propaganda about the past says that was the Dark Ages. That was the age of superstition, and everybody thought the world was flat, which is a myth. In the Middle Ages, people did not think that the world was flat. Everybody pretty much knew otherwise. I mean, from many, many centuries before that, people observed that if you watched a ship sail over the horizon, the bottom part of the ship disappeared from your view, and then the middle part, and then the top of the sail, and so on. Now, what does that mean? But we like to think we're so smart, and everybody in the past was so stupid, and everybody thought the world was flat. Well, they didn't, Everybody thought Columbus was going to sail off the edge of the world, No, nobody thought that when Columbus sailed. They thought he might sail to who knows where and get lost, but they didn't think he was going to sail off the edge of the world. But we have been told all these ridiculous ideas because of this kind of condescension towards the past. And that past is the Christian past. It's a Christian era. And it's part of this kind of propaganda war to say that today we have all this scientific understanding, but a few centuries ago, everybody was superstitious and ignorant and so on. And with that false perspective and science and Christianity being in opposition to one another, that's bad for Christianity. Because science brings a lot of useful things into our lives, right? Things keep getting better in a material sense in certain respects. So, religion doesn't bring inventions directly, but actually the perspective of the Bible is what led to the scientific revolution. Religion, this is in the back of the minds of modern man. Religion is seen as something kind of irrelevant. If you want to go to the privacy of your own home and believe whatever, good for you, but that doesn't have much relevance. That's just your opinion. Isn't religion just superstition? Can't we explain everything purely naturalistically, with no need for anything that's not physical? And the answer actually is no. The idea that we're just a chemical being, that we're just a physical being, that, for example, there's no such thing as a mind. There's only a brain, and there's neurons firing, and there's no such thing as a non-material mind, has very little support scientifically or philosophically. All of the experiments that are conducted fail to produce any sign of that. For example, in studying people who have epilepsy and other seizure disorders, many of them have volunteered to have electrodes put into their brain so that they could be measured and tested and so on. And in the course of all these experiments, the doctors, the medical researchers have experimented with stimulating different parts of the brain, stimulating 2 different parts of the brain at once, stimulating 3 different parts of the brain at once, and so on. And when you do that, nobody ever says, oh, wow, I started thinking about God when you stimulated those 3 parts. Do that again. Yeah, it made me think about God again or something. That's never happened. Or even abstract things like love or whatever. That doesn't happen, ever. Many thousands of experiments with tens of thousands of people. There's something you choose to think about. And think about that. To say that you choose means it's something besides you being a bag of chemicals. Because then the chemicals would be your destiny and force you to think this and think that. But that is not what scientific research indicates. But for people who have decided that science is up here and religion and the supernatural are down here and that's all superstition, there's a need to believe that. And one of the interesting things is one of the best sources on all this research was actually written by an atheist. A man named Thomas Nagel wrote a book called Mind and Cosmos. And the subtitle is Why the Materialist means there's nothing but the material world, there is no supernatural world. That's a philosophy. Why the materialist neo-Darwinian conception of nature is almost certainly false. And he goes through looking at a lot of this and shows, no, you cannot reduce everything to physics and chemistry. There are such things as mind, separate from brain. But the interesting thing is, he's still an atheist. And he gets to the end of the book, and he says that he's hoping for another answer besides God. He's hoping that something else will be discovered that will explain all this. From an atheist perspective, he admits it's not explained at all right now. But he is not willing to say, therefore, you must have a spirit and there must be a supernatural world. And so he concludes by saying, hopefully someday we'll understand all this. But what that something else is, he has no idea. Christians shouldn't be timid about their faith. We shouldn't be thinking that we have anything to be embarrassed about, that in this modern scientific world, that we're just clinging to some ancient idea. That's not the case. We should be rejoicing in the revelation of God through his Son because it's true. And because there is no good explanation otherwise for how this character came about. But another thing that has driven people away from Jesus is this relativism of modern times, that there's no absolute truth. There's your truth, there's my truth. You want to believe that, fine. You want to believe something different, fine. And any claim of absolute truth is rejected. But you see, Jesus claimed to be the way to God. Now, that's not a very popular claim to make today, is it? As people got more and more familiar with the religions of the world, a lot of people developed this hope that maybe they all lead to God, or maybe they all lead to understanding of the truth, and so on. And generally, when people say that, they haven't really learned much about those other religions, because when two things flatly contradict each other, they're not going to be true at the same time. And so you really need to have a pretty superficial understanding of these other religions to think they can all be true at once, because they have completely contradictory ideas to each other, much less to Christianity. But that's, the kind of tolerant age we live in. Wouldn't it be nice if every religion were just as true as every other religion and we don't have to argue about anything, about what is truth? Everybody can just believe whatever they want to believe, and that's cool. And nobody needs to persuade anybody else of anything, and so on. If they could all be equally true, they could all lead to some kind of enlightenment. And then along comes one of them that says, no, actually, this is the truth. This is the truth. And this is how God wants you to relate to him today, period. That's what Jesus says. I am the way and the truth and the life, and no one comes to the Father except by me. And when Paul encountered the idol, the statue to the unknown God, he used that as an entry point to discussion. But his point was, you recognize there must be something out there that you don't understand. Well, I will tell you what it is. There is, in fact, one God, and he created everything. And we worship what we understand, and you obviously still don't understand. That's not a very popular message today, right? Wouldn't it be nicer to just say, look, if you want to believe that, fine. I won't bother you. Well, it's nicer if you don't really care about people continuing to miss out on this incredible Jesus. If you don't mind people continuing to live in pagan ignorance, then I guess that's what Paul should have done. But actually, that doesn't really demonstrate much love for them, does it? Go ahead and live in pagan ignorance the rest of your lives, and I'll keep my mouth shut. If Paul had taken that approach, is that love? But today, if you don't take that approach, you're the troublemaker. You're supposed to just let everybody, believe whatever, let's chill, and don't worry about it. So, if Jesus is this divisive figure who claims to be the exclusive way to God, then who wants to really, really study Jesus? So that's a problem facing Christians in 21st century America. We've got to realize we're swimming against the tide. We think we have this amazing Jesus to tell people about, but we've got to realize that it has to be done knowing that not everybody thinks that there's this wonderful Jesus. A lot of them think Jesus is a problem. And we have to overcome that in evangelism. We have to have a testimony from our own lives and an example from our own lives, but we also have to be ready to answer why we would believe such a thing. Why would you believe that Jesus is exclusively the way? Well, that goes back to what we studied during this lesson series, that Jesus truly is the incarnate Son of God. He really is a revelation from heaven. He really is unique. And there is nothing like Jesus in any other religion. And there's no character like Jesus anywhere else in any religion, not even in literature, not even in fiction. And you have to believe that and be ready to present that to justify why are you teaching such an exclusive thing. Exclusion isn't good in today's world. And finally, I'll just add an idea of my own to the author's list. We don't tend to know very much about the ancient pagan world. Most of us would rather spend our time studying the Bible and studying Christian books, not studying paganism or mythology or something like that, right? And so we don't appreciate how revolutionary Jesus was because we don't understand the world he came into and how different it was. Even the Jewish world, let alone the pagan world. Just think about the Jewish world that Jesus came into. What was the reaction of Jews when Jesus claimed to be equal to the Father? What kind of reception did that get? That's blasphemy. Right? Which also raises the point, the apostles being Jews, having been raised from infancy as Jews, were highly unlikely to concoct a character like Jesus, because this was not exactly the Messiah that they were expecting. And certainly the claims that Jesus made about his divinity that we've looked at, the authority to forgive sins, to heal directly of his own power, and so on. The claim that you don't know the Father unless you know me, and so on. All of these things were nothing like what the Jews of his day expected. But then also when you move to the pagan world, now that's really a contrast. And we take this kind of thing for granted. Sometimes we teach about the differences, like when it says, husbands, love your wives. That's a verse that we would find easy to take for granted. But in the Greco-Roman world, in the Egyptian world, and so on, husbands were not given any such commandment. Marriages were quite often arranged. They were arranged for the purposes of having children and grandchildren and so on. And that's it. Wife's job was to have children. And husband's job was to provide for that. Love your wife. There was no command, love your wife. You know. So after almost 2,000 years of Christianity, we take it for granted. But in the ancient world, this kind of thing was revolutionary. And then there are other commands. Fathers are told, don't exasperate your children. Don't be harsh with your children when you provide discipline and so on. Were Greek and Roman fathers given any such command or limitation? Were they really supposed to worry about, oh no, I might have exasperated, the child, I might have been too harsh with the child? Not at all. We take all kinds of things for granted, and occasionally we will teach in such a way as to shine a light on how revolutionary individual things like this were. But we don't always realize fully that because we don't spend a lot of time studying the ancient world outside the Bible. I know I read a book a couple of years ago about mythology, about Greek and Roman mythology, and I recall thinking, well, I was in the middle of reading it, but I think I won't bring that to church with me, because if somebody sees it, that'll look kind of interesting. I can bring a Christian book, but here's my Bible and here's my mythology book might look a little odd, right? But at the time I was reading it, as a Christian, what kept striking me was how different this is from the Bible. And I would think, okay, a certain myth goes back 600 or 700 years BC, but the Old Testament was being written before that, and along with during that time. And the level of the Old Testament in terms of morality and theology is so different from the ancient world around it. How could it be different? How could the Old Testament be on such a higher level of thought than all of these pagan mythologies that surrounded it? For example, we know that the flood story spread throughout that area after the flood, after Babel, after the scattering. Everybody had their own version of it. And sometimes people will try to make it sound like these versions are closer to the biblical version than they are. You would expect something in common just from oral transmission. But it's almost comical, though, when you read myths from outside the Bible. You might have heard that the Babylonians preserved, they changed it quite a bit over the years, but they preserved a flood story. Do you know why there was a flood in the Babylonian myth? Think about this in terms of moral and theological level. In the Babylonian myth, people started to populate, and the gods and goddesses got annoyed with them because as the population grew, people made too much noise. And so the gods decided, let's wipe them out with a flood. Think about the level of that compared to the biblical flood story. At the same time that Bible stories are being written in the Old Testament, you have stories like that. One of the Babylonian goddesses, overheard the plan to kill off all the people and decided to go warn the kind of Noah figure, the one who was going to build a boat. But there was a problem. She had sworn to the other gods and goddesses not to tell any person. So how did she get around that? She got into a room with the Noah figure, and instead of talking to him, she turned and talked to the wall and let him hear. See, so that way she's kept her promise not to tell him. I mean, this is like child stuff. But this is the mythology that surrounded these Israelites in ancient times. And I say, if you go and study these things, it makes you appreciate the Bible. No, the Bible's not some ancient superstition or mythology. All you have to do is compare. And you'll never take for granted again what we've been given by God here in these scriptures, and in particular, this character of Jesus should always be something that inspires awe in us. Thank you very much for your time. Larry, you'll be teaching next week.